Michel de Montaigne, writing in the 1500s, did something philosophers before him rarely dared. He made himself the subject of philosophy. Not to glorify himself, but to understand what it means to be human by examining the only specimen he could truly know, his own mind. This was revolutionary. For 2,000 years, philosophers sought universal truths, eternal forms, mathematical certainties. Montaigne said, "Wait. Before we claim to understand the cosmos, God, or the good life, can we even understand ourselves?" His answer, after decades of self-examination, was unsettling. We are far stranger, more contradictory and less rational than we pretend to be. But here is what makes Montaigne exceptional. He did not write systematic philosophy. He wrote essays, literally attempts or trials, where he followed his mind wherever it wandered. One moment discussing cannibals, the next his kidney stones, then suddenly ancient Roman military tactics, all circling back to some insight about human nature. This method was not laziness. It was profound philosophical methodology disguised as casual conversation. What you are about to encounter is not feel-good wisdom or life hacks. Montaigne demands something harder, that you question everything you think you know, especially about yourself. Part 1. The Method of Wandering Thought. Understanding Montaigne requires grasping why he wrote the way he did. The essay form was not simply his chosen genre. It was his entire philosophy made concrete. Before Montaigne, philosophical writing followed rigid structures. You stated premises, developed arguments through logical steps, reached conclusions. Plato had his dialogues, Aristotle his systematic treatises, medieval scholastics their disputations. All assumed that truth had a shape, a structure that thought could follow like a path through a garden. Montaigne rejected this utterly. Not because he was anti-intellectual, he was steeped in classical learning, but because he believed this approach falsified how thinking actually works. Real thought, honest thought, does not march in straight lines. It circles, backtracks, contradicts itself, gets distracted, then suddenly illuminates something from an unexpected angle. Consider how he begins his essay on friendship. He starts by discussing why he is writing, admits he does not know exactly, wanders into discussing his dead friend, circles back to whether fathers and sons can be true friends, veers into classical examples, questions his own motivations, again and only gradually through this spiralling approach, arrives at something true about friendship that no systematic treatise could capture. This was not random. Montaigne believed that capturing truth, especially truth about human nature, requires preserving the messy process of discovery. When philosophers clean up their arguments, presenting only the polished final product, they lie. They pretend they reasoned their way to truth through pure logic, when actually they stumbled upon it through confusion, contradiction, and accident. Here is the deeper point scholars often miss. Montaigne was practicing what we might call phenomenology 300 years before Husserl invented the term. He wanted to describe consciousness as it actually operates, not as logic texts claimed it should operate. And consciousness, he discovered through relentless self-observation, is wildly inconsistent. He writes, "I cannot keep my subject still. It goes along befuddled and staggering with a natural drunkenness. This drunkenness is not a flaw to overcome. It is the truth of human thinking. We are not rational machines occasionally disrupted by emotion. We are complex, self-contradicting processes of becoming, and any philosophy that ignores this will produce beautiful systems disconnected from reality. The practical application here cuts against everything modern culture teaches about clear communication. Montaigne suggests that sometimes, maybe often, the messy explanation is the truer explanation. When someone gives you a perfectly logical account of why they made a decision, especially an important life decision, they are probably lying or self-deceived. The truth involves multiple conflicting motives, half-formed intuitions, emotional reactions they do not fully understand, and post hoc rationalizations. This has profound implications for how we judge others and ourselves. If we accept Montaigne's method as truth-tracking rather than just stylistic choice, we must grant people, including ourselves, far more contradictoriness than we typically allow. You are not hypocritical when you value honesty yet tell white lies, or treasure solitude yet crave company. You are human, which means being multiple conflicting tendencies rather than a single coherent self. But here is where critics attack. 17th-century rationalists like Descartes found Montaigne's approach appalling. How can you build knowledge on such unstable foundations? If everything is uncertain, contradictory, shifting, where do we find solid ground for science, ethics, or political order? Descartes explicitly designed his method as the opposite of Montaigne's wandering, seeking absolute certainty that could withstand all doubt. Modern analytic philosophers often share this frustration. They want arguments you can formalize, test, refute, or confirm. Montaigne gives you something closer to literary exploration, which feels intellectually irresponsible. How do we distinguish his genuine insights from his errors if he refuses to argue systematically? The defense requires understanding what Montaigne thought philosophy was for. It was not primarily about accumulating true propositions. It was about cultivating a certain quality of mind, flexible, self-aware, humble before complexity. His essays train you to think better not by teaching doctrines, but by example, by showing you a mind honestly at work, including its confusions and uncertainties. This connects to an educational insight that is being rediscovered now. Students learn more from watching authentic problem-solving, including mistakes and dead ends, than from seeing only polished solutions. Montaigne understood this about philosophical education 4 centuries early. Yet the method has real limits. It works brilliantly for questions about human psychology, ethics and meaning, where systematic approaches often fail to capture lived experience. It works poorly for mathematics, physics, or any domain where reality has structure independent of human perspective. Montaigne would be terrible at chemistry. His approach cannot build the cumulative knowledge that science requires. This reveals something crucial about intellectual method. Different questions require different approaches. The mistake is not Montaigne's essaying or Descartes' systematic doubt, but assuming one method works for everything. Modern academia often errs by trying to force Montaigne's questions about meaning, value, and human nature into Cartesian frameworks, or by dismissing such questions as unscientific when they resist formalization. The contemporary relevance strikes hard. We live in an era of hot takes where everyone must have a clear position immediately on every issue. Montaigne's method suggests this is not just impractical, but epistemically wrong. Complex questions deserve wandering thought, contradictory perspectives held simultaneously, conclusions suspended until understanding deepens. His essays model what genuine thinking looks like, and it looks nothing like our social media discourse. Part 2. What do I know? In 1563, Montaigne had a phrase engraved on a medal he wore, "Que sais-je?", which translates to, "What do I know?" This was not false modesty. It was his philosophical foundation, radical doubt about humanity's capacity to know anything with certainty. But Montaigne's skepticism was completely different from the destructive nihilism people often associate with doubt. He was reviving ancient Pyrrhonian skepticism, a school that used doubt not to deny truth, but to achieve tranquility by suspending judgment on matters beyond human comprehension. Here is how it worked practically. Montaigne observed that humans across history confidently believed contradictory things. Ancient Greeks thought slavery natural. Christians thought it abomination. Romans saw gladiatorial combat as noble. Later Europeans found it barbaric. Every culture believes its customs are natural, rational, and self-evident, yet customs contradict wildly across time and space. The same pattern appears in philosophy and science. The greatest minds, Aristotle, Plato, Aquinas, each constructed comprehensive systems explaining reality, and these systems fundamentally contradicted each other. Each philosopher thought he had finally grasped truth, yet the next generation found fatal flaws. Why should we assume our generation has escaped this pattern? Montaigne pushed further into epistemology, the study of knowledge itself. Consider how we know anything. Through our senses, right? But our senses constantly deceive us. A tower looks round from far away, square up close. Water feels warm after ice, cool after fire. Drunk people see double, fevered people hallucinate. We trust our senses when healthy, but not when sick. But how do we know we are not always in some state of distortion? Maybe we use reason to correct sense errors, but reason contradicts itself too. Smart people reach opposite conclusions from the same evidence. Our reasoning depends on assumptions we cannot prove, like that the future will resemble the past, or that nature follows consistent laws. These feel obvious, but feelings of obviousness have been wrong before, about everything from Earth's shape to disease transmission. Here is the devastating example Montaigne uses. When a dog tracks prey by scent, choosing the correct path at a fork after smelling the other paths, is the dog doing logical reasoning? It seems to be this or this or this, not this, therefore this. But we do not credit dogs with rational souls. So either dogs reason, undermining human uniqueness, or something that looks exactly like reasoning can happen without reason, which means our sense of rational certainty proves nothing. The practical application cuts deep into how we live. Think about your certainties, your unshakable beliefs about politics, religion, morality, how life should be lived. Montaigne asks, have you considered that people just as intelligent as you, with access to the same evidence, believe the opposite with equal certainty? and not fools or villains, but thoughtful people who examine the question seriously. This should make us humble, but it rarely does. Montaigne noticed that humans have a psychological need for certainty that overwhelms evidence. We would rather be certainly wrong than uncertain. Uncertainty feels dangerous, destabilizing, like standing on nothing. So we construct certainties, often unconsciously, then defend them as if our lives depend on it, which psychologically they do. But here is where Montaigne's skepticism becomes liberating rather than paralyzing. If you accept that you might be wrong about almost everything, you become teachable. You can listen to opposing views without feeling threatened, because admitting error does not destroy your identity. Your identity becomes the person who questions, not the person who knows. This transformed how Montaigne engaged with ideas. He read voraciously ancient pagans and church fathers, scientists and poets, travellers' accounts of distant cultures. He did not read to confirm what he already believed. He read to be disturbed, to encounter perspectives so different they forced him to question his assumptions. This is the opposite of how most people consume information today, seeking sources that validate existing beliefs. The scholarly debate around Montaigne's skepticism is fierce. Some argue he was a sincere Pyrrhonian, genuinely suspending judgment on all matters, including religion. Others claim his skepticism was a cover for heterodoxy, a way to question church dogma without getting burned alive, which was a real risk in 16th century France. Still others see his skepticism as selective, applied to philosophy and human customs, but not to faith, which he accepted as beyond reason's jurisdiction. The textual evidence is genuinely ambiguous. Montaigne professes Catholic orthodoxy repeatedly, but often in passages that feel almost sarcastic. He says reason cannot prove God, so we must rely on faith, but this can be read as pious submission or veiled atheism. Scholars will never resolve this because Montaigne deliberately cultivated ambiguity. He wanted readers to think, not to receive doctrines. Here is where the philosophy gets personally challenging. Try this experiment. Take something you believe strongly, maybe that democracy is the best government, or that honesty is always right, or that your career path is correct. Now, genuinely try to argue the opposite, not a straw man version, but the strongest possible case against your belief. Most people cannot do this. They can only caricature opposing views. Montaigne could do it brilliantly, arguing all sides of any question with equal force, and this is not relativism, but intellectual honesty. The critique from rationalists and religious authorities was immediate and severe. The Church put Montaigne's essays on the index of forbidden books, though later removed them. Rationalists argued his skepticism was self-refuting. If you know nothing, how do you know that? And practically dangerous, if nothing is certain, why not murder and steal? Montaigne had answers. First, his skepticism was not about practical matters where we have reliable experience. He did not doubt that bread nourishes or fire burns. He doubted metaphysical claims about the universe's ultimate nature, the soul's immortality, the foundations of morality, things beyond human capacity to verify. Second, morality does not require metaphysical certainty. We can live ethically based on custom, empathy, and practical wisdom without needing absolute foundations. In fact, Montaigne thought the most dangerous people were those absolutely certain of their righteousness, because certainty enables cruelty. The religious wars devastating France in his lifetime were not fought by doubters, but by fanatics, convinced God endorsed their violence. This connects to perhaps his most important insight. Intellectual humility does not produce weak convictions or cowardice. Montaigne lived through civil war, served as mayor during plague and conflict, negotiated between warring factions. He acted decisively while maintaining inner uncertainty about ultimate truths. This is the hardest philosophical position to inhabit, acting as if your beliefs might be wrong while still acting on them, but it might be the wisest. Where does Montaigne's skepticism fail? It struggles with accumulated knowledge. Yes, past thinkers were often wrong, but science does progress. We genuinely know more about medicine, astronomy, and physics than Aristotle did. Montaigne's skepticism, applied too broadly, cannot account for this genuine growth in knowledge. It works for metaphysics and ethics, where questions remain perpetually open, but fails for domains with empirical testing and cumulative progress. Also, psychological insight aside, humans need some certainties to function. Complete suspension of judgment about everything produces not tranquility, but paralysis. You cannot deliberate every morning whether to get out of bed, whether language means anything, whether other people exist. Some beliefs must be held unreflectively as background for living, and Montaigne does not give clear guidance on which. The contemporary application is urgent. We live in an era of epistemological crisis, where people cannot agree on basic facts, not just values. Montaigne would see this coming. When certainty becomes untethered from evidence, when people believe what feels right rather than what reasoning supports, intellectual chaos follows. But his solution, cultivated doubt and humility, seems impossibly difficult in our polarized moment. Still, maybe that difficulty is why we need it most. Part 3. The Self as Laboratory. Montaigne did something no philosopher had done before. He made himself the primary subject of his investigation, not because he thought he was special, but because he was the only specimen of humanity he could truly examine from inside. This sounds narcissistic until you understand the methodology. Montaigne was not writing autobiography or memoir. He was using introspection as experimental philosophy, observing his own mind with the same detachment a scientist observes nature. The goal was not self-expression, but self-knowledge as a path to understanding human nature generally. He writes, "I study myself more than any other subject. That is my metaphysics, that is my physics." This reversal of traditional philosophy was radical. For 2 millennia, philosophers had looked outward, toward ideal forms, toward God, toward nature's laws, believing that truth lay outside the messy subjective self. Montaigne said, no, start with the self, because the self is what you actually have access to. But here is the paradox scholars grapple with. Montaigne simultaneously claims to describe only himself, this particular man, Michel de Montaigne, while implicitly suggesting his self-observations reveal universal truths about humanity. He writes, "Every man bears the entire form of the human condition," meaning his individual experience contains patterns everyone shares. How can this be true? If I examine my particular quirks, How does that tell you anything about yourself? Montaigne's answer is subtle. He is not claiming his specific traits are universal. Not everyone loves cats and hates doctors as he did. Rather, the structure of selfhood itself, the contradictions, the self-deceptions, the gap between what we think we are and what we actually do, this is universal. Consider his method in practice. He describes how he behaves in trivial situations, how he prefers his food seasoned, how he sits on horseback, how he reacts when someone contradicts him in conversation. This seems absurdly mundane for philosophy, but through these tiny observations he reveals massive truths about human nature that abstract theorizing misses. For example, he notices that his opinions on serious matters, religion, politics, ethics, shift based on his bodily state. When his kidneys hurt, when he has eaten well, when he has slept poorly, his philosophical judgments change. This should not happen if reason operates independently of body, but it does, constantly. Therefore, our vaunted rationality is far more embodied and contingent than we admit. Or consider his observations on conversation. Montaigne loved debate, but noticed something disturbing about himself. In arguments, he rarely changed his mind based on better reasoning. Instead, he found himself automatically defending whatever position he had stated, even if he privately recognized its weaknesses. And he watched others do the same. People argue to win, not to discover truth, even when they claim otherwise. This kind of psychological insight, now confirmed by modern research on motivated reasoning and confirmation bias, Montaigne discovered through ruthless self-observation 4 centuries ago. He could do this only by treating himself as an object of study rather than assuming his conscious self-understanding was accurate. The practical application requires uncommon honesty. Try observing yourself the way Montaigne did, not your official self-story, but your actual behavior. You claim to value family, but how much time do you actually spend with them versus scrolling phones? You believe you are rational, but track how many decisions you make on gut feeling, then rationalize afterward. You think you know your values, but notice when you compromise them for convenience and invent justifications immediately. This practice is profoundly uncomfortable. Most people cannot sustain it for even one day without encountering truths they would rather avoid. We are strangers to ourselves, Montaigne insists, and the strangest thing is how strenuously we avoid acknowledging this strangeness. He goes further into what we now call the unconscious. Montaigne noticed that much of what he did had no conscious motivation he could identify. He would find himself angry without knowing why, attracted to ideas he could not justify, repelled by people for no articulable reason. Rather than inventing explanations, he admitted ignorance about his own drives. This anticipated Freud's recognition that consciousness is a small part of mental life, most of which operates in darkness. But Montaigne made an even bolder claim. Not only do we not understand ourselves now, we are different people at different times. He writes, "I do not portray being, I portray passing." The self is not a stable substance, but a process of continuous change. The Montaigne writing today is not the same Montaigne who wrote yesterday or will write tomorrow. This idea, now called the fluidity of self, was philosophically shocking. Western thought from Plato through Christianity assumed the soul was an unchanging essence that persisted through time. Montaigne's introspection revealed no such thing. He found only a stream of perceptions, thoughts and feelings with no permanent core underneath. If you look for your essential self, you find only particular moments of experience that never repeat exactly. The implications are staggering for identity and responsibility. If I am not the same person I was 20 years ago, am I responsible for that person's actions? If myself is constantly reconstructing, what does personal integrity even mean? Montaigne did not resolve these questions, but he forced them into philosophy in a way that still troubles us. Scholars debate whether Montaigne discovered the modern self or demonstrated its impossibility. Some argue he invented autobiography and introspection as we know it, making subjectivity central to philosophy and literature. Others claim he showed the self is incoherent, too contradictory and fluid to be a genuine philosophical category, anticipating postmodern critiques of identity. Both readings find support in his texts because he never resolved the tension. The critique from multiple directions is severe. Rationalists argued that studying one peculiar individual tells us nothing general, that philosophy requires universal principles derived from reason, not from one man's quirks. Religious thinkers worried his focus on the changeable self ignored the eternal soul. Modern scientists note that introspection is notoriously unreliable. We cannot accurately observe our own mental processes because observation changes what is observed. These critiques have force. Montaigne's method cannot produce the systematic knowledge that science requires. You cannot generalize from n equals 1, one single case study, no matter how carefully observed. And introspection alone cannot reveal unconscious processes, brain mechanisms, or evolutionary patterns that shape behavior without our awareness. But here is what Montaigne understood that his critics missed. Certain truths are only accessible from the inside. What it feels like to be afraid, to desire, to doubt, to hope, these experiences have a first-person character that third-person observation cannot capture. And these subjective dimensions matter for ethics, meaning, and how we should live, which remain philosophy's central questions. Modern neuroscience is learning this again. You can map every neural correlation of consciousness, but you still have not explained what consciousness feels like from within. The hard problem of consciousness, why experience feels like something, requires phenomenological description that Montaigne pioneered, not just mechanistic explanation. Where does the self as laboratory method fail most dramatically? In assuming that intensive self-examination leads to self-knowledge. Sometimes it does, but psychology shows it can also produce confabulation, inventing plausible-sounding stories about ourselves that bear little relation to our actual motives. Montaigne was aware of self-deception, but perhaps not how deep it goes. We cannot think our way out of cognitive biases by thinking harder, we just generate more sophisticated rationalizations. Also, the method has a class and privilege dimension Montaigne never acknowledged. He could spend decades examining himself because he was wealthy, male, and freed from manual labor. Most humans across history have not had the luxury of extended introspection. They were busy surviving. So his philosophy of self-examination, while profound, assumes leisure and security not everyone possesses. The contemporary relevance is double-edged. On one hand, we live in an era of performative self-revelation through social media, everyone presenting curated selves and calling it authenticity. This is the opposite of Montaigne's ruthless self-examination. It is self-creation disguised as self-discovery. On the other hand, modern therapy and mindfulness practices revive Montaigne's project of sustained self-observation, though often without his intellectual rigour. We need his method now, genuine introspection that faces uncomfortable truths, not the therapeutic culture that validates whatever we feel. Part 4. Custom is king. Montaigne's most subversive idea might be this: almost everything you think is natural, rational, and obviously right is actually arbitrary custom that you absorbed without thinking. This sounds like modern cultural relativism, but Montaigne reached it 500 years ago through reading travel accounts and ancient sources. He writes, "The laws of conscience which we say are born of nature, are born of custom." This is explosive. If conscience itself, our deepest sense of right and wrong, comes from custom rather than nature or divine law, then morality has no absolute foundation. Each culture's moral certainties are just that culture's contingent practices, no more objectively true than any other culture's opposite practices. Consider his method for reaching this conclusion. Montaigne collected examples of human diversity with almost anthropological thoroughness. Some cultures consider it loving to eat deceased relatives, others find this horrifying. Some societies practice polygamy as moral duty, others see it as sin. Warriors in one culture must avenge insults with death, in another turning the other cheek shows strength. Each society considers its own practices natural and opposing practices barbaric. But here is the key move. Montaigne does not stop at cataloguing differences. He asks, how do practices come to feel natural when they are clearly learned? Through habituation beginning in childhood. We absorb our culture's customs before we can reason about them, and once internalized, they feel like objective reality rather than social construction. He gives the example of his own relationship to food. He cannot eat certain animals that other cultures relish because his upbringing taught him these animals are disgusting. This disgust feels like natural biological response, but it cannot be, because people elsewhere eat exactly these animals with pleasure. So his visceral disgust, which feels like nature speaking, is actually custom so deeply learned it mimics instinct. The implications cascade. If this is true for food preferences, what about sexual morality? Marriage customs, political systems, religious beliefs? Montaigne suggests custom operates everywhere we think nature speaks, which means our moral intuitions, our sense of what is self-evidently right, are culturally constructed all the way down. This leads to his famous essay on cannibals. Europeans were encountering indigenous peoples in the Americas and declaring them savage barbarians who ate human flesh. Montaigne inverts the judgment. Yes, some tribes practice ritual cannibalism, eating parts of defeated enemies as a spiritual act. But Europeans torture people elaborately for religious differences, tear them apart with horses for heresy, burn them alive for witchcraft. Which is actually more barbaric, he asks, eating the dead or torturing the living? His point is not that cannibalism is good. His point is that Europeans have no ground for moral superiority. Every culture has practices that others find abhorrent, and each culture considers its own practices justified while condemning others. This symmetry should produce humility, but instead produces mutual certainty of the other's barbarism. The practical application challenges everything about how we judge. Think about practices you find obviously wrong, maybe certain religious restrictions, or social hierarchies, or family structures from other cultures. Now imagine someone from that culture examining your practices with equal horror, your individualism, your treatment of elderly, your gender relations, your worship of wealth. Both judgments feel absolutely justified from inside each cultural frame, and neither has access to some neutral standpoint from which to adjudicate. Montaigne pushes this to uncomfortable places with gender and sexuality. He notes that different cultures have wildly different norms for marriage, sexual practice, gender roles, family structure. Some accept practices that Christianity condemns, others forbid what Christianity permits. If nature truly dictated one correct form, why the massive variation? The only explanation is that all these systems are cultural inventions, not natural law. This made him dangerous. The Catholic Church, the monarchy and social order all depended on claiming their authority reflected natural law or divine command. If Montaigne is right that these are just customs, arbitrary and changeable, then no authority has absolute legitimacy. Everything becomes negotiable, which is terrifying for those in power and potentially liberating for those oppressed by existing arrangements. But scholars debate how radical Montaigne really was. Some argue he was a proto-liberal, undermining traditional authority to create space for individual freedom and tolerance. Others claim he was actually conservative, arguing that since no custom is absolutely right, we might as well stick with existing customs rather than risk chaos through reform. Both readings find textual support, because Montaigne says both things at different times, sometimes in the same essay. This connects to his political philosophy, which we will explore more later. He lived through France's wars of religion, where Catholics and Protestants massacred each other over whose interpretation of Christianity was correct. From his cultural relativism, both sides were equally deluded, fighting over customs each mistook for absolute truth. The solution was not victory for one side, but mutual recognition of uncertainty and agreement to coexist despite difference. The critique of Montaigne's relativism comes from multiple angles. Moral realists argue that some things are genuinely wrong, regardless of culture, slavery, torture, rape, genocide. Montaigne's framework seems unable to condemn these absolutely, which is a fatal flaw. If all morality is custom, then Nazi customs are just as valid as any others, which is absurd. Religious critics argued even more forcefully. If God's law is absolute, then it does not matter that humans disagree or that customs vary. Custom might explain human belief, but not moral truth, which is grounded in divine command. Montaigne's relativism mistakes human fallibility for divine non-existence. Modern anthropology has complicated Montaigne's picture. While cultures do vary dramatically, there are also human universals, prohibitions against murder within the group, incest taboos, reciprocity norms, care for children. These suggest some moral content might be naturally selected rather than purely customary. which weakens Montaigne's claim that conscience is entirely custom-born. Montaigne has responses, though they do not fully satisfy critics. First, he distinguishes between fundamental ethical principles like not harming others needlessly, which appear across cultures, and specific implementations, which vary wildly. The implementations are custom, even if some core principles are universal. Second, he argues that even if some practices like genocide are objectively wrong, we still lack access to objective moral knowledge that would let us know this with certainty. Every culture thinks its moral judgments are objective, yet they contradict, so our feeling of objectivity is not reliable evidence of actual objectivity. Third, and most important, Montaigne thought moral certainty was more dangerous than moral uncertainty. The worst atrocities come from people absolutely convinced of their righteousness. Some moral humility, recognizing that our deepest convictions might be merely custom, could reduce violence, even if it risks relativism. Where does custom thinking fail most seriously? In providing guidance for moral progress. If all customs are equally arbitrary, why change them? Why should we have abolished slavery, given women rights, extended moral consideration to animals? Montaigne's framework struggles to explain how we can judge some customs better than others without appealing to standards beyond custom itself. Also, the observation that customs vary does not prove they are all equally valid. Maybe some cultures have discovered moral truths that others missed, the way some cultures discovered scientific truths earlier than others. Variation in belief does not prove absence of truth, it might just prove that truth is hard to find. The contemporary application is everywhere. We live in a globalized world where different cultural values collide constantly, individualism versus collectivism, secular versus religious worldviews, different conceptions of human rights, family, gender, freedom. Montaigne's framework helps us understand why these conflicts are so intractable. Each side is speaking from within a custom system that feels like natural truth. But it does not tell us how to resolve conflicts, only how to understand why they persist. Part 5. Learning to Die. Montaigne's philosophy begins with death. His earliest essays obsessively discuss mortality, and the most famous line might be, "To philosophize is to learn how to die." This sounds morbid, but Montaigne meant something quite specific and ultimately liberating. The idea comes from ancient Stoicism, particularly Seneca and Cicero, whom Montaigne read deeply. The Stoics argued that fear of death corrupts everything about how we live. If you desperately cling to life, you become a coward, avoiding risks, refusing to stand up for principles, making yourself small to stay safe. True freedom requires accepting death's inevitability, which removes its power to terrorize you into bad choices. In his early essays, Montaigne embraces this Stoic program wholeheartedly. He fills pages with examples of how to face death courageously, stories of ancient Romans who died nobly, techniques for meditating on mortality, arguments that death is natural and therefore nothing to fear. He practices imagining his own death, rehearsing it mentally, trying to domesticate the terror through familiarity. But then something changed. In 1569, Montaigne nearly died after falling from a horse. He lost consciousness, coughed up blood, seemed dead to witnesses. The experience transformed his philosophy of death completely. He describes the experience in detail, unusual for the time. Drifting in and out of consciousness, he felt no fear, no pain, only a dreamy, pleasant sensation of letting go. Death, when it actually arrived at his door, was nothing like his philosophical preparations suggested. It was not a battle requiring courage, it was more like falling asleep, natural and almost sweet. This experience led to a radical revision. In later essays, Montaigne abandons the Stoic program of constantly thinking about death. He writes, "If you do not know how to die, do not worry. Nature will tell you what to do on the spot, fully and adequately. She will do this job perfectly for you. Do not bother yourself." This is an astonishing reversal for a philosopher. He is saying his entire early philosophy was wrong, that thinking constantly about death does not prepare you for it, and actually makes life worse. Better to mostly forget about death and focus on living, trusting that when the moment comes, your body will know what to do without your philosophical preparations. But the philosophy gets more subtle. Montaigne is not abandoning the question of how to approach mortality, he is changing the answer. The early Stoic approach tried to master death through reason, make it familiar, rob it of power through mental discipline. The later approach accepts that death remains unknown and unknowable, and that this unknowing is okay. You cannot prepare for death, you can only live well, and living well means not being constantly preoccupied with death. This connects to his broader philosophy of accepting limits. We cannot know what death is like, we cannot eliminate the fear entirely, we cannot control when or how it comes. Accepting these limits, rather than fighting them with philosophy, brings more peace than Stoic mental discipline. This is a profoundly anti-philosophical conclusion from a philosopher, admitting philosophy cannot solve what it promised to solve. The practical application challenges both denial and obsession. Modern culture oscillates between these extremes, either refusing to think about death at all, pretending we are immortal, or becoming anxious and morbid when mortality forces itself on attention. Montaigne suggests a middle path, acknowledging death's reality without letting it dominate your thoughts. He gives concrete guidance. Do not postpone living until you feel safe or accomplished or ready, because these conditions never fully arrive, and then death interrupts. Instead, treat each day as sufficient unto itself, complete regardless of how many more days follow. This is not carpe diem hedonism. It is something more contemplative, finding satisfaction in present existence without needing it to continue indefinitely. Montaigne also explored death through loss. His closest friend, Etienne de la Boétie, died young, and Montaigne was devastated. He describes the grief as making him feel he was only half alive, that part of him died with his friend. This contradicts Stoic teaching that the wise person remains unmoved by loss. Montaigne rejects this. Grief is natural and appropriate when you lose someone you truly loved. Trying to eliminate it through philosophy is not wisdom, but inhuman coldness. This opens a larger question about what philosophy can do. The Stoics promised ataraxia, undisturbed tranquility, achieved through correct reasoning about what is truly good. Montaigne tried this and found it did not work, or worked only superficially. You can convince yourself intellectually that death is nothing to fear, but the visceral fear remains. and suppressing it takes constant effort that itself disrupts tranquility. So perhaps philosophy's job is not eliminating fear or grief, but helping you live alongside them. Not mastering emotion through reason, but understanding emotion's place in human life, which is central and ineliminable. This anticipates modern views that see emotion not as reason's enemy, but as a form of intelligence itself. The scholarly debate about Montaigne's death philosophy centres on whether his later position is genuinely different from Stoicism or just Stoicism refined. Some argue he remains fundamentally Stoic, still seeking tranquility through accepting what you cannot control. Others see a break towards something like Epicureanism, focusing on present pleasure and withdrawing from anxiety about distant futures, including death. A third group argues he moves beyond both schools toward a more naturalistic acceptance that has no ancient precedent. The textual evidence supports all readings because Montaigne never systematized his later view. He drops hints, contradicts himself, revisits the question from different angles without reaching final conclusions. This might frustrate scholars seeking clear doctrines, but it reflects Montaigne's belief that death remains mysterious, and philosophy's uncertainty about it is honest. Critics point out real problems with Montaigne's later approach. Telling people not to worry about death because nature handles it works fine for those dying peacefully or quickly. But what about people facing prolonged suffering, dementia, agonizing disease? Nature does not handle these cases with the gentle ease Montaigne describes. His philosophy risks becoming a comfortable view for the healthy that collapses when serious suffering arrives. Also, his advice to stop thinking about death might be privilege speaking. If you are wealthy, healthy and secure, like Montaigne, you can afford not to dwell on mortality. But people facing poverty, violence or terminal illness cannot stop thinking about death. It imposes itself daily. Montaigne's later philosophy assumes a safety he never fully acknowledged was not universal. Where does his death philosophy succeed most? Pause. In diagnosing how fear of death distorts living. People spend decades preparing for a retirement they might not reach, sacrificing present happiness for future security that death may interrupt. They avoid risks that could bring meaning, because those risks also bring danger. They measure life by duration rather than depth, assuming more years means a better life. Montaigne challenges all this, suggesting that a well-lived shorter life exceeds a long, miserable one in every important way. The contemporary relevance cuts deep. Modern medicine has made death seem like a medical failure rather than a natural conclusion, something to fight with every intervention regardless of quality of life. Montaigne would see this as exactly wrong, mistaking quantity for quality, letting fear of death corrupt the dying process itself. His philosophy supports movements for death with dignity, hospice care. Accepting death when fighting it only prolongs suffering. But these remain controversial precisely because we have not done what Montaigne demands, philosophically accepting mortality as part of life rather than its enemy. Part 6. The Wisdom of the Body. Montaigne's philosophy is deeply radically physical in ways that still make academics uncomfortable. He writes constantly about his body, his digestion, his kidney stones, his sexual function, his preference for standing while writing. This was scandalous for philosophy, which since Plato had tried to transcend the body's messy particularity to reach eternal truths. But Montaigne insisted the body is not incidental to thinking, it is fundamental. He writes, "We are neither above nor below the rest. All that is under heaven undergoes the same law and fortune." Meaning humans are animals, subject to physical laws shaped by bodily needs, and philosophy that ignores this produces nonsense detached from how humans actually are. Consider his most radical claim about mind and body. Montaigne observed that his philosophical opinions changed based on his physical state, not just moods, but actual positions on serious questions. When healthy, he found certain arguments compelling. When in pain from kidney stones, those same arguments seemed wrong, and opposite arguments seemed right. This should not happen if reason operates independently of body, but it does. The implication is devastating for traditional philosophy. If your most carefully reasoned positions depend on whether you have eaten, slept well, or are in pain, then reason is not the independent truth-tracking faculty philosophers claimed. It is embodied, influenced constantly by physical states you do not control or even notice. Pure reason, reason operating free from bodily influence, might not exist. Montaigne pushed this insight into areas philosophy avoided. He wrote frankly about sexual desire, not moralizing, but observing. He noted that sexual desire makes people stupid, causes them to abandon judgment, drives them to risk everything for momentary pleasure. But this is not a moral failing to overcome through willpower. It is how bodies work. The desire is not in your control, and moralizing about it mostly produces hypocrisy, people pretending they are not driven by desires everyone has. He extends this to all appetites, hunger, thirst, the need for sleep. These are not unfortunate interruptions to the life of the mind. They are the life of the mind, or at least inseparable from it. A philosopher who has not eaten thinks differently, worse than one who has eaten well. This is not profound, it is obvious, yet philosophy builds systems that ignore it completely. The practical application is immediate and uncomfortable. Notice how your opinions shift based on physical states. That argument you found convincing yesterday before lunch, check if you still find it convincing after sleeping poorly tonight. That decision that seemed obviously right when you felt healthy, reconsider it when you have a cold. Montaigne is not saying abandon reasoning. He is saying recognize how contingent and embodied your reasoning is. This has major implications for ethics. Traditional moral philosophy, especially Kantian ethics, demands that we act from pure reason, setting aside physical inclinations. Montaigne says this is impossible, and attempting it makes people worse, not better. They become hypocrites, maintaining public righteousness while secretly indulging desires they claim not to have. Better to acknowledge desire's reality and negotiate with it honestly than pretend you transcend it through willpower. He applies this specifically to sexual morality. His era taught that celibacy was spiritually superior to marriage, that resisting sexual desire proved moral strength. Montaigne thought this created monsters, people tormented by desires they could not eliminate, often projecting that torment onto others through cruel enforcement of impossible standards. Better to accept sexuality as natural and build ethics that work with human nature rather than against it. But Montaigne is not endorsing hedonism or unlimited appetite satisfaction. He distinguishes between natural needs and artificial desires. Natural needs, eating when hungry, sleeping when tired, sex within reason, these should be satisfied straightforwardly without shame. Artificial desires, the need for luxury, status, power, endless accumulation, these can never be satisfied, and trying to satisfy them makes you miserable. The wisdom is telling them apart, which requires attention to your actual body rather than to social messages about what you should want. Montaigne describes his own bodily regime with surprising detail. He ate simply, exercised through walking and horseback riding, refused most medicine because doctors seemed to do more harm than good. He drank wine, but not to excess, enjoyed physical pleasures, but not obsessively. This was not asceticism, it was attunement, listening to what his body actually needed, rather than imposing philosophical or religious ideas onto it. The most controversial application involves illness and medicine. Montaigne suffered excruciating kidney stones for years, yet he refused most treatments offered by physicians. His reasoning was empirical. He watched treatments fail more often than succeed, watched doctors contradict each other, saw people made worse by interventions. He trusted his body's healing capacities more than medical authority. Modern medicine makes this position look foolish. We can now treat conditions Montaigne could not. But he would ask how much modern medical intervention improves life versus how much extends suffering, medicates problems caused by lifestyle, or treats symptoms while ignoring causes. His skepticism about medicine was not anti-science. It was empirical observation that medical authority often exceeds medical knowledge, something arguably still true. The scholarly debate about Montaigne's embodied philosophy centers on whether he is materialist or dualist. Some argue he reduces mind to body, denying any immaterial soul, which would be heresy in his time. Others claim he just emphasizes mind-body connection without denying the soul's existence. A third view suggests he remained genuinely uncertain, observing the intimate connection without claiming to understand its ultimate nature. The textual evidence is ambiguous, as always. Montaigne professes belief in the immortal soul, as Catholic doctrine requires, but he also writes that animals likely have reasoning and memory, which implies souls, and if animals have souls, the human soul might not be special. He never resolves this clearly, which might be deliberate ambiguity to avoid dangerous conclusions. Critics attack Montaigne's embodied philosophy from multiple angles. Rationalists argue that reducing reason to bodily states makes truth impossible. If your beliefs depend on digestion, how can any belief claim objective validity? This is the self-refuting problem. Is Montaigne's own philosophy true, or just the product of his particular bodily state when writing? Religious critics saw his emphasis on bodily wisdom as dangerous materialism, undermining the soul's primacy and human superiority to animals. If we are just clever animals driven by physical needs, what ground is there for morality, religion, or human dignity? Modern feminists have complex responses. Some celebrate Montaigne for validating embodied experience against masculine rationalist traditions that denigrate the body. Others note that his body is specifically male and privileged, and he writes little about bodily experiences he does not have, like menstruation, pregnancy, or childbirth. His philosophy of the body risks universalizing particularly male embodiment. Where does embodied philosophy succeed most powerfully? In explaining irrationality. Why do smart people believe obvious nonsense, make terrible decisions, abandon their principles? Traditional philosophy blames moral weakness or faulty reasoning. Montaigne suggests embodiment. You are tired, stressed, in pain, frightened or lustful, and these states hijack judgment in ways willpower cannot overcome. This is less moralistic and more accurate to lived experience than rationalist accounts. The contemporary application is urgent in an age of disembodiment. People spend hours daily staring at screens, sitting motionless, eating processed food, sleeping poorly, then wonder why they feel terrible mentally. Montaigne would say you cannot separate mental and physical health. They are the same health. Treating anxiety with only therapy and medication while ignoring sleep, diet, movement, and physical environment misunderstands human nature fundamentally. Also relevant is his critique of medical authority. Modern medicine produces miracles but also excessive intervention, treating normal aging as disease, pathologizing difference, prioritizing profit over health. Montaigne's skepticism about expert authority when it contradicts bodily wisdom remains valuable. Sometimes your body knows better than your doctor what it needs, though discerning when requires the discrimination Montaigne cultivated, and we rarely do. Part 7. Perfect Friendship. Montaigne's deepest emotional experience was his friendship with Étienne de la Boétie, a friendship so profound that when La Boétie died young, Montaigne said half of himself died too. This relationship shaped his entire philosophy of human connection. The two men met when Montaigne was about 30, La Boétie slightly older. Both were lawyers. Both loved classical literature, both had philosophical temperaments. But Montaigne describes their connection as something beyond shared interests, a mysterious affinity where each immediately recognized the other as essential. He writes, "If you press me to say why I loved him, I can say no more than because he was he and I was I." This is philosophically rich. Montaigne is claiming that the deepest human connections have no reason, no cause you can articulate. They just are, and attempts to explain them falsify their nature. Love, real love, whether romantic or friendship, is not based on the loved person's qualities, because then you would love anyone with those qualities. It is particular and irreplaceable, directed toward this specific person's irreducible individuality. Montaigne distinguishes this perfect friendship from other relationships. Family relations are based on duty and accident of birth. You did not choose your family. Romantic relationships are complicated by sexual desire, which clouds judgment and creates possessiveness. Most social relationships are based on utility, people helping each other for mutual benefit. None of these reach what Montaigne means by perfect friendship. Perfect friendship, he argues, requires several conditions rarely met. First, complete mutual openness. The friends hide nothing from each other, share their worst thoughts and fears, do not perform or curate their presentation. Second, equality of soul. Both must be capable of the same depth of relationship, same commitment, same capacity for understanding. Third, virtue in both parties. This is not conventional morality, but something like character strength, the capacity to sustain deep relationship without betrayal. Most importantly, perfect friendship involves a kind of fusion of selves. Montaigne describes it as a soul in two bodies, where the boundary between self and other becomes porous. La Boétie's thoughts became Montaigne's thoughts. His interests became Montaigne's interests, not through imitation, but through genuine shared consciousness. Each felt the other's joy and pain as immediately as his own. This sounds romantic, which raises questions scholars debate endlessly. Was this a homoerotic relationship that Montaigne could not name in his homophobic culture? The intensity of feeling, the language of love and fusion, the devastation at loss, all suggest romantic passion. But Montaigne insists it was not sexual, and taking him at his word, he is describing something we might now call platonic intimacy at its deepest possible level. The practical application challenges how we think about friendship today. Modern friendship is often casual, multiple friendships of varying depth, people you enjoy spending time with, but who remain somewhat outside your inner life. Montaigne describes something completely different, a relationship as central to identity as family or romantic partnership, maybe more central. But here is the paradox he acknowledges. Such friendships are extremely rare. Montaigne says most people never experience one in their lifetime. They require compatible people meeting at the right time with enough freedom from duty to develop deep connection. And they are fragile. Death or distance or life changes can destroy them. So, while perfect friendship is the highest human relationship, it is also nearly unattainable for most people, most of the time. When La Boétie died after a brief illness, Montaigne was present and devastated. He describes the death scene in detail, La Boétie giving final instructions, expressing love, maintaining dignity even as he weakened. Montaigne felt this loss as mutilation, like losing a limb or organ, because La Boétie was not external to him, but part of his very self. This experience led to a profound insight about grief. Montaigne could not console himself with philosophy. Stoic arguments that death is natural, that grief is irrational, that the wise person remains undisturbed, all these seemed like hollow abstractions. The grief was real, justified, and ineliminable. Trying to philosophize it away would dishonor the friendship and falsify human experience. So Montaigne embraced the grief, let it transform him, and eventually found that writing about La Boétie kept the connection alive in new form. The essays themselves became a continuation of their conversation, Montaigne writing partly to the friend who could no longer respond. This is not unhealthy attachment to the past, but a way of integrating loss without denying its significance. The philosophical implications challenge individualism. If the self is not a closed, self-sufficient unit, but depends on intimate relationships for its very constitution, then we are more vulnerable and interdependent than liberal philosophy admits. Losing a person you love is not just losing external support, it is losing part of yourself, which is why grief feels like dying. This connects to contemporary debates about autonomy and relational identity. Feminist philosophers argue that traditional ethics overemphasizes individual autonomy and undervalues the relationships through which selves develop and sustain themselves. Montaigne anticipated this critique, showing through his experience with La Boétie that the deepest human experiences involve transcending separate selfhood through intimate connection. But critics point out an uncomfortable fact. Montaigne's perfect friendship was between two educated, wealthy French men of the same social class. Could such friendship exist across inequalities of power, gender, race, or class? Montaigne assumes equality is necessary, but in his society, equality only existed among a narrow slice of privileged men. So his philosophy of friendship might be beautiful, but inaccessible to most humans who live in unequal circumstances. Also problematic is his claim that such friendship can only happen once in a lifetime and only between two people. This seems unnecessarily restrictive. Many people experience multiple deep friendships at different life stages, and friend groups, not just pairs, can provide intimacy and mutual support. Montaigne might be describing one particular form of connection, intense dyadic friendship, while missing other equally valuable forms. Modern psychology would question some of Montaigne's claims about friendship fusion. Healthy relationships require maintaining some boundaries and separate identity, not complete merger of selves. What Montaigne describes might be codependency, an enmeshment that becomes destructive if the relationship ends or one person wants autonomy. His idealization of friendship might romanticize what is actually unhealthy attachment. Montaigne could respond that critics misunderstand fusion. He is not describing loss of separate identity, but something more subtle, a relationship where each person's flourishing includes the other's flourishing as constituent part, not instrumental means. This is different from codependency, which is about neediness and control, whereas perfect friendship is about mutual enhancement and freedom. Where does Montaigne's friendship philosophy succeed most powerfully? In articulating what intimate connection feels like and why it matters so much for human meaning. Philosophers often discuss friendship instrumentally as useful for achieving other goods. Montaigne insists it is not instrumental at all. It is one of the ultimate goods, an end in itself, maybe the most important thing in human life, aside from virtue. The contemporary relevance strikes in an era of loneliness. Despite social media connection, surveys show increasing numbers of people report having no close friends, no one they can confide in deeply. Modern life's transience, careerism, and digital mediation all work against the conditions Montaigne describes for deep friendship, time, proximity, vulnerability, sustained attention. His philosophy reminds us what we are losing and why we feel so alienated despite being constantly connected. Part 8. Against Pedantry. Montaigne revolutionized educational philosophy by attacking the very thing most people think education means, accumulating knowledge. He argued that filling students' heads with information, especially when they do not understand or care about it, produces pompous fools rather than wise people. His target was the Renaissance educational system he experienced himself. Students memorize classical texts, learned to quote authorities in Latin and Greek, accumulated vast stores of learning they could recite on demand. This seemed like education, and these learned men were considered wise. But Montaigne thought it was fake wisdom, a performance of learning that had nothing to do with understanding. He writes with withering scorn about pedants, People who can quote Seneca on every topic but have no judgment of their own, who know ancient history perfectly but cannot navigate their own lives. They are, he says, like pack animals carrying books. The books do not become part of them, they just drag them along. The metaphor is cutting. A donkey carrying a load of books is not learned. The books remain external cargo. Similarly, a student who memorizes without understanding carries knowledge externally without it transforming their mind. Real learning is digestion, taking in information and breaking it down until it becomes part of your own thinking, indistinguishable from your natural judgment. Montaigne proposes a radically different educational method. Instead of starting with texts and authorities, start with the student's own mind. Present them with questions, problems, situations where they must think for themselves without knowing what authorities say. Only after they have wrestled with problems independently, formed tentative judgments, should they encounter how others address the same questions. This reversal is crucial. If you tell students what Aristotle said before they think independently, they will either accept or reject Aristotle on authority rather than judgment. But if they first develop their own tentative answers, then encounter Aristotle, they can genuinely engage, see where Aristotle illuminates what they confused, where he is wrong, where they need to think further. The learning becomes active, not passive absorption. Montaigne also insists education must connect to life. What use is knowing ancient battles if you cannot make good decisions? What value is classical literature if it does not help you live better? He would rather see students learn through experience, travel, conversation, observing human behaviour, than through endless textbook study of dead knowledge. He gives a practical test of education. Present two people, one stuffed with learning who can discourse learnedly about virtue, justice and wisdom, and another with less book knowledge but sound judgment who acts well in difficult situations. Which is truly educated? Montaigne insists the second person, because education's purpose is forming good judgment and character, not displaying erudition. This led to his famous preference for a well-made head over a well-filled head. A well-made head thinks clearly, judges soundly, adapts to new situations, and keeps learning throughout life. A well-filled head knows many things, but cannot think independently, parrots authorities, and stops developing once formal education ends. Montaigne wanted education to produce the first, but observed it typically produce the second. The practical application requires rethinking everything about schooling. Instead of lectures where teachers transmit information and students memorize, Montaigne would prefer seminars where students struggle with problems together, where being wrong is part of learning, where the teacher guides rather than dictates. Instead of testing recall of facts, test ability to analyze new situations using whatever knowledge helps. Instead of rewarding those who best regurgitate correct answers, reward those who think most interestingly and originally. Montaigne also advocated learning through doing rather than abstract study. Want to learn ethics? Do not start with Aristotle's ethics. Start by observing people, noticing what works and what fails, reflecting on your own choices. Then read Aristotle to see what his framework illuminates or misses. Want to learn politics? Study actual political situations, how decisions were made and what resulted, not just theories of ideal government. This connects to his skepticism about expertise. Montaigne noticed that the most learned experts often gave terrible advice because their learning was detached from reality. Doctors memorized ancient medical texts but killed patients with treatments that experience showed did not work. Philosophers constructed beautiful systems with no connection to how humans actually are. Lawyers knew endless precedents but could not see justice. Real expertise, Montaigne insisted, combines knowledge with judgment developed through experience and self-awareness. You need to know your domain, but also know your limitations, know when book knowledge fails, know how to learn from mistakes. The pedant has only the first element, which is why they are dangerous when given authority. The scholarly debate about Montaigne's educational philosophy centres on whether he is anti-intellectual. Critics argue that dismissing book learning risks producing ignorant people with strong opinions, but no knowledge base. If everyone just forms independent judgments before studying what humanity has learned, they will reinvent the wheel badly, repeating ancient mistakes. Montaigne's defenders insist he is not against learning, but against how learning typically happens. He loved books, filled his essays with classical quotations, and spent his life reading. But he read actively, arguing with texts, applying them to life, not passively absorbing them as authority. He wants students to learn this active reading, which requires first developing independent judgment to argue back with. Modern educational theorists have rediscovered Montaigne's insights. Constructivist approaches emphasize that students construct knowledge actively rather than receiving it passively, exactly what Montaigne advocated. Problem-based learning, where students tackle realistic problems before learning theory, follows his method. Critiques of standardized testing that rewards memorization over understanding echo his attack on pedantry. But the critique cuts both ways. While Montaigne is right that memorization without understanding is empty, some domains require accumulated knowledge before judgment develops. You cannot learn mathematics by independently discovering theorems. You must learn what mathematics knows before you can extend it. Same for languages, sciences, any cumulative field. Montaigne's model works better for philosophy, ethics and practical wisdom than for technical domains. Also problematic is access. Montaigne could afford to learn through travel, conversation with educated people, reading extensively in his library, and thinking at leisure because he was wealthy. Most people need efficient education to earn living, cannot spend years developing judgment through experience, must learn what works quickly. His ideal education assumes privilege he does not acknowledge. Where does Montaigne's educational philosophy succeed most powerfully? In diagnosing why educated people are often foolish. Education credentials signal knowledge but not wisdom, and confusing them produces credentialed idiots making terrible decisions with confidence derived from degrees rather than judgment. This is everywhere in modern life. Experts who know their narrow field but lack broader understanding. Specialists who cannot think outside their training. The contemporary relevance is massive. Modern education faces the problems Montaigne identified. Students memorize for tests, then forget immediately. Learning feels disconnected from life. Grades matter more than understanding. Creativity gets punished because it does not match answer keys. His philosophy points toward education that develops judgment, creativity, self-awareness and adaptability, exactly what future economies will need, as specific knowledge dates quickly while general intelligence endures. Part 9. Living with Contradiction. Montaigne's ethics are maddeningly unsystematic because he rejected the very idea that ethics could be systematic. He observed that human beings are walking contradictions, believing opposite things, acting against their own principles, never consistent even with themselves. Traditional ethics tried to eliminate this contradiction through reason, but Montaigne thought the contradiction is truth, not error to overcome. He writes, "We are entirely made up of bits and pieces, woven together so diversely and so shapelessly that each one of them pulls its own way at every moment. And there is as much difference between us and ourselves as there is between us and other people." This is devastating for ethics based on unified rational agency. Consider how ethical rules work in traditional philosophy. You identify a principle like tell the truth, then you universalize it, apply it consistently in all situations. Kant made this the foundation of ethics. The categorical imperative demands consistency, but Montaigne observed that living this way is impossible and attempting it makes you worse, not better. Why impossible? Because situations differ in ways that resist universal rules. Sometimes telling truth harms innocent people. Sometimes lying prevents greater evil. Sometimes the truth is unknowable, so you must speak uncertainly. You could add qualifications and exceptions to your rule, but then the rule becomes so complex it is useless, and you still cannot anticipate every situation's uniqueness. Montaigne's alternative is what we might call situational wisdom. Instead of applying rules, you develop judgment through experience, reading, observation, and self-knowledge. This judgment lets you see what each situation requires without following algorithms. It is not relativism, because judgment can be better or worse, but it is not rule-following either. But here is where it gets harder. Montaigne insists that even with good judgment, you will contradict yourself, act inconsistently, sometimes do things you know are wrong. This is not moral weakness exactly, it is human nature. You are not a unified self with consistent desires and values. You are multiple conflicting impulses that different circumstances bring forward. The practical application is both liberating and challenging. Stop expecting yourself to be perfectly consistent. You value honesty but sometimes lie, treasure friendship but sometimes neglect friends, believe in generosity but sometimes act selfishly. This does not make you a hypocrite, it makes you human. Hypocrisy is claiming perfection while secretly failing. Montaigne advocates acknowledging imperfection openly. He extends this to moral evaluation of others. When judging someone's character, Montaigne insists you must consider their whole lives, not single acts. Someone might act courageously one day and cowardly the next, generously in one situation and selfishly in another. This does not mean character is meaningless, but character is tendencies and patterns, not absolute traits. Even saints have moments of pettiness, even scoundrels moments of nobility. This complicates moral praise and blame considerably. If everyone is contradictory, containing good and bad, on what basis do we condemn anyone? Montaigne's answer is proportion and tendency. Some people's contradictions lean toward cruelty, deception and harm. others toward kindness, honesty, and help. Judge by overall pattern, not by finding single counterexamples. But he also insists on moral humility. When you condemn someone else's vice, remember you likely have that vice too, maybe expressed differently or more subtly, but present nonetheless. This does not mean abandoning moral judgment. It means judging with awareness that you are not morally superior, but lucky, having different circumstances and temperaments that steer you away from that particular vice toward different ones. Montaigne's specific ethical recommendations are scattered and seemingly random. He values moderation generally, but not absolute rules about it. He thinks cruelty is the worst vice because it involves taking pleasure in others' pain, but he does not build a system from this insight. He admires Socratic wisdom, knowing that you do not know, but also values decisive action when needed. He treasures honor and reputation, but also thinks they are largely illusions. Scholars try to find patterns in this apparent chaos. Some argue that Montaigne is virtue ethicist, focusing on character over rules or outcomes. Others see him as early pragmatist, judging actions by practical consequences in specific contexts. Still others claim he is neo-Stoic, seeking tranquility through accepting what cannot be controlled while acting on what can. All these readings find support because Montaigne draws on all these traditions without committing fully to any. The critique from systematic ethics is severe. How do you teach Montaigne's ethics? How do you apply them to novel moral problems like artificial intelligence, genetic engineering, climate change? Situation-specific judgment without principles gives no guidance when facing unprecedented situations. And moral wisdom through experience takes a lifetime to develop. What do young people do before they have it? Montaigne's response would be that this difficulty is truth's price. Ethics that feels systematic and clear is false comfort. It oversimplifies moral reality to make it manageable. Real moral life is messy, uncertain, full of dilemmas with no good answer, and any ethics that does not reflect this messiness is dishonest. Better honest difficulty than false clarity. But critics point to dangerous implications. If everyone's ethics are situational and self-contradictory, how do we build moral community? How do we coordinate around shared values? How do we hold anyone accountable when everyone can say, "I am just humanly inconsistent"? Montaigne's ethics might work for individual self-understanding, but fail for social cooperation, requiring predictable rule-following. Where does his ethics succeed most powerfully? In describing moral psychology accurately. People do not actually follow the ethical theories they profess. Everyone knows this from observing themselves and others, yet philosophical ethics mostly ignores this gap between theory and practice. Montaigne makes the gap central, asking how we should live, given that we are inconsistent, self-deceiving, and pulled by conflicting values we cannot reconcile. The contemporary relevance cuts against cancel culture and moral absolutism. Modern discourse treats moral failures as defining. A single racist comment or past bad act makes someone irredeemably evil. Montaigne's insistence on human contradiction suggests this is both inaccurate and counterproductive. People contain multitudes, good and bad together, and moral growth requires acknowledging failures without defining selves by them. This is harder than absolute judgment, but truer to human reality. Part 10. The Cruelty Problem. Of all human vices, Montaigne singles out cruelty as uniquely abhorrent. Not just harming others, which sometimes necessity demands, but taking pleasure in causing pain, delighting in another's suffering for its own sake. This was not abstract moralizing. Montaigne lived through the French wars of religion, where Catholics and Protestants tortured each other with inventive sadism, all claiming God's approval. He writes with visceral horror about the cruelties he witnessed. People flayed alive, burned slowly to maximize suffering, broken on wheels, torn apart by animals, all while crowds watched as entertainment. What disturbed Montaigne most was not that humans could inflict such pain. Survival sometimes requires violence, but that they enjoyed it, felt righteous doing it, brought their children to watch as moral education. This observation led to a profound psychological insight. Cruelty does not come from wickedness alone, it comes from righteousness. The most horrible atrocities are committed by people absolutely certain of their moral correctness, convinced their victims deserve suffering, believing themselves instruments of justice or divine will. Moral certainty enables cruelty that mere selfishness never could. Montaigne noticed something else disturbing. Cruelty escalates. It starts with punishing genuine wrongdoers, which seems justified, then extends to punishing those who tolerate wrongdoers, then to those insufficiently enthusiastic about punishment, until everyone is potentially guilty and terror becomes normal. He was describing what we now call totalitarian psychology, where moral crusades devour their own children. The connection to certainty is crucial. If you know absolutely what God wants, or what justice requires, or what history demands, then obstacles to your vision become not just wrong, but evil incarnate, not just opponents, but enemies of all that is good. This transforms disagreement into cosmic warfare, where any cruelty is justified because the stakes are absolute. Montaigne saw this pattern in religious fanatics on both sides, each torturing in God's name. His solution was radical for his time. Refuse certainty about ultimate things, especially about who deserves to suffer. This does not mean abandoning judgment or punishment entirely. Societies need both. But it means approaching them with horror at their necessity rather than pleasure in their execution, doing minimal harm required rather than maximum harm possible, and recognizing you might be wrong about who deserves what. Montaigne extended this to everyday cruelties, not just dramatic atrocities. He observed how people casually inflict small cruelties, enjoying gossip that ruins reputations, taking pleasure in others' failures, mocking those with less power, being unnecessarily harsh to servants or children. These small cruelties, multiplied across society, create vast suffering despite not being dramatic individual acts. The practical application requires uncomfortable self-examination. Notice when you feel pleasure at someone else's suffering, even subtle satisfaction when an annoying colleague fails, or when someone you dislike experiences setback. This Schadenfreude, as Germans call it, is universal but dangerous. Montaigne insists we should actively resist it, not indulge it, because it cultivates the psychological capacity for greater cruelty. He also examined cruelty toward animals with unusual sensitivity for his era. Most philosophers dismissed animal suffering as irrelevant. Animals lacked rational souls, so their pain did not matter morally. Montaigne rejected this completely. Animals clearly suffer. Their pain is real regardless of whether they reason philosophically about it, and taking pleasure in animal suffering reveals the same cruel disposition that produces human atrocities. This led him to criticize hunting for sport, animal baiting, and casual violence toward animals. Not because animals have rights in modern sense, that concept did not exist, but because cruelty toward anything capable of suffering corrupts the person doing it. You cannot compartmentalize being cruel to animals, then kind to humans. Cruelty is a character trait that seeks outlets, and normalizing it anywhere normalizes it everywhere. The psychological insight goes deeper. Montaigne observed that cruelty often masks fear and weakness. The torturer is terrified of his victim's ideas or existence, so he must utterly destroy them to feel safe. The bully picks on weaker targets because confronting equals threatens his fragile ego. Cruelty is not strength, but weakness, pretending to be strong through domination. This connects to his broader view of human nature. Humans are not naturally cruel. Children must be taught to take pleasure in suffering, but we are naturally fearful and insecure. Cruelty develops as a defense mechanism, establishing dominance to ward off threats real and imagined. Understanding this does not excuse cruelty, but helps explain why it is so common despite being universally condemned in principle. Scholars debate whether Montaigne's focus on cruelty as the worst vice is philosophically justified. Consequentialists might argue that incompetence or indifference causes more total harm than cruelty. A careless policymaker kills more people than a sadistic individual. Deontologists might say lying or betrayal violate human dignity more fundamentally. Why privilege cruelty above other vices? Montaigne's answer seems to be psychological rather than purely philosophical. Cruelty is uniquely dangerous because it is self-reinforcing. It feels good to the cruel person, which encourages repetition and escalation. Other vices are self-limiting. Greed eventually satisfies or exhausts itself. Lust burns out. Even hatred can fade. But cruelty feeds on itself, each act making the next easier and more pleasurable, which is why it spirals into atrocity. The critique from tougher-minded thinkers is that Montaigne is too squeamish. Sometimes cruelty is necessary. Harsh punishment deters crime. Torture might extract information, preventing worse harm. Showing weakness invites aggression. His horror at cruelty, however sincere, risks producing a philosophy too soft for a hard world. Montaigne anticipated this objection. He distinguishes between necessary harm and unnecessary cruelty. Killing in self-defense or just war might be necessary, but torturing prisoners for pleasure is not. Executing criminals might be required, but doing so sadistically and publicly as entertainment is not. The necessity is one thing, the pleasure taken in it is another, and only the latter constitutes true cruelty. But critics push back that this distinction is unstable. Who decides what harm is necessary? History is full of people claiming their cruelties were necessary, required by circumstances, unavoidable for some greater good. Montaigne's standard might be right in principle, but useless in practice, because everyone will claim their harm is the necessary kind. There is also a question about Montaigne's consistency. He condemns cruelty, yet served in government and military roles that surely involved sanctioning violence against others. He owned property in a system built on inequality and exploitation, benefited from social hierarchies maintained through force. Was he being hypocritical, or recognizing tragic necessity that his philosophy helps us see but cannot eliminate? Where does Montaigne's analysis of cruelty succeed most powerfully? In connecting it to certainty and righteousness. This insight explains why the worst atrocities come from idealists, religious believers, revolutionary movements, anyone convinced they serve ultimate good. Pure selfishness is limited in its cruelty because it calculates costs, but righteous cruelty knows no limits because any cost is justified by the supreme importance of the cause. The contemporary relevance is everywhere and urgent. Online culture enables cruelty through anonymity and distance. People say things to others they would never say face to face, taking pleasure in causing emotional pain. Cancel culture often crosses from accountability into cruelty. The pleasure taken in destroying someone's life and reputation goes beyond what justice requires. Political polarization produces dehumanization, where people openly fantasize about harm to their opponents, which Montaigne would recognize as the early stages of escalating cruelty. His warning about certainty seems more relevant than ever. Whether left or right, religious or secular, nationalist or globalist, those most certain of their righteousness often prove most willing to be cruel to achieve their ends. Montaigne's insistence on uncertainty, humility and horror at suffering offers an antidote, though one our polarized age seems determined to reject. Part 11. Politics without certainty. Montaigne lived through political chaos, France tearing itself apart in religious civil wars that killed hundreds of thousands. Yet he somehow maintained political roles, serving as mayor of Bordeaux, negotiating between warring factions, while holding philosophical views that questioned all political authorities' foundations. This tension produced a political philosophy both radical and conservative, skeptical and pragmatic. His fundamental political insight starts from custom. Political systems, forms of government, laws and constitutions, all these are human inventions with no natural or divine foundation. Monarchy is not ordained by God. Democracy is not written in nature. All systems are contingent historical developments that could have been otherwise. This makes political authority deeply problematic because it cannot claim the absolute legitimacy it pretends to have. But here is the paradox that drives Montaigne's politics. Even though political systems have no absolute foundation, stability requires people believe they do. If everyone recognized that laws are arbitrary conventions, social order would collapse into chaos with everyone pursuing self-interest. So political authority depends on noble lies, myths of legitimacy that Montaigne sees through but thinks necessary for others. This produces his conservative conclusions from radical premises. Since all systems are arbitrary, no reform can establish truly just government. You are just replacing one set of conventions with another. But the process of reform itself is dangerous. It disrupts the myths that hold society together, produces instability and violence, often making things worse. Therefore, better to maintain existing systems despite their injustices than risk reform's chaos. Montaigne watched revolutionary reformers tear France apart, each side certain they were establishing true justice. Catholics killing Protestants to restore proper religion, Protestants killing Catholics to establish authentic Christianity, both producing atrocities in service of their certainties. From his perspective, both were equally deluded, fighting over which set of conventions should dominate, neither recognizing that all political and religious systems are human constructions. His solution was what we might call pragmatic conservatism. Preserve existing institutions not because they are just, but because they are familiar, known, and replacing them risks worse outcomes. Reform only when absolutely necessary, slowly, partially, maintaining continuity wherever possible. Never reform out of ideological certainty about how things should be, only from practical necessity addressing concrete problems. This led to his position on the wars of religion. Both sides should compromise, recognizing that religious truth is unknowable, accepting that people will disagree, finding ways to coexist despite difference. But this position was unacceptable to both Catholics and Protestants, each certain they possessed absolute truth that could not be compromised. Montaigne's religious tolerance was based on skepticism about religious knowledge, which made him suspect to all believers. The practical application of his political thought is deeply ambiguous. On one hand, it counsels caution about revolutionary change, recognizing that destroying existing systems often produces worse outcomes even when those systems are unjust. Gradual reform preserving continuity is safer than radical rupture. On the other hand, this can become an excuse for tolerating massive injustice, telling oppressed people to accept their oppression because change is risky. Montaigne seemed aware of this tension, but never resolved it. He personally opposed religious persecution, argued for tolerance, recognized that existing hierarchies were unjust. But he also thought that attempting to eliminate injustice through political action often made things worse, producing new forms of oppression under banners of liberation. This creates a tragic view where injustice is inevitable and efforts to eliminate it counterproductive. His view of political participation was similarly ambiguous. He served in political roles when called but without enthusiasm, viewing politics as necessary but corrupting. He thought good people should engage in politics but remain inwardly detached, doing what duty requires without letting political power inflate their ego or political conflict consume their peace. This separation of outer action and inner attitude is classic Stoic wisdom applied to public life. Montaigne also developed what we might call a politics of civility. In public disputes, treat opponents with respect even while disagreeing, recognize their humanity even when opposing their positions, maintain personal relationships across political divides. He practiced this himself, maintaining friendships with both Catholics and Protestants, refusing to demonize either side. This was both politically strategic, making him useful as negotiator, and philosophically consistent. His skepticism meant neither side had absolute truth, justifying absolute loyalty. But scholars debate whether Montaigne's skeptical politics is genuinely neutral or covertly partisan. Some argue that calling for compromise between unequal parties favours the powerful, telling the oppressed to accept partial justice while the powerful make minimal concessions. His tolerance seems noble, but might enable injustice by treating oppressors and oppressed as morally equivalent parties to negotiate. Others defend Montaigne by noting the specific context. In religious civil war, where both sides commit atrocities, advocating tolerance and compromise was genuinely neutral, not favouring either Catholic or Protestant. His position became conservative only in retrospect, when we know Protestantism eventually established itself and expanded freedom. From his perspective during ongoing war, neither side deserved victory and peace through compromise beat continued violence. The critique from democratic theory is that Montaigne's skepticism undermines political legitimacy too much. If all political systems are arbitrary, why obey any of them? If laws have no foundation beyond convention, why not violate them when convenient? Democracy needs citizens who believe in its legitimacy, that popular sovereignty and equal rights are not just conventions, but genuine moral truths. Montaigne's thoroughgoing skepticism seems to undermine this necessary belief. His response would be that political legitimacy based on false certainties is dangerous. Yes, democracy functions better when people believe it is morally superior to alternatives, but this belief produces its own pathologies. Democratic crusades to spread democracy globally, democratic majorities oppressing minorities in the name of popular will, democratic certainty that opposing views are not just wrong, but evil. Some skepticism about democracy's absolute rightness might make it function better, not worse, by tempering its excesses. Modern liberalism has an uncomfortable relationship with Montaigne. His skepticism and tolerance seem to anticipate liberal values, and indeed many credit him as early liberal thinker. But his conservatism and skepticism about reform clash with liberalism's progressive commitments. Liberals want tolerance grounded in human rights and dignity. Montaigne offered tolerance grounded in uncertainty about who is right. These produce similar practices, but from incompatible foundations. Where does Montaigne's political philosophy succeed most powerfully? In diagnosing the dangers of political certainty. The worst political crimes come from people absolutely convinced of their righteousness, whether religious fanatics, revolutionary idealists, or nationalist zealots. His insistence that all political systems are contingent human constructions, none divinely ordained or naturally necessary, could reduce this dangerous certainty if people took it seriously. Also valuable is his politics of civility and personal relationships across divides. Maintaining friendship with people you disagree with politically, refusing to let political differences define human worth, separating arguments from people, all these practices help preserve social fabric despite deep disagreement. Montaigne modelled this himself, and it is increasingly rare in polarised modern politics. The contemporary relevance is massive but contested. On one hand, Montaigne's skepticism about political certainty and his counsels of caution seem desperately needed in an age of polarisation and extremism. On the other hand, major injustices like climate change require urgent coordinated action, not sceptical caution about whether reforms will work. Perhaps Montaigne's wisdom applies to some political questions, those involving competing values or uncertain outcomes, but not to others where scientific evidence demands action despite uncertainty about solutions. Part 12. The Examined Life in Practice. Montaigne's philosophy was not just theoretical, it was a lived practice, a way of being in the world that he cultivated daily through writing and reflection. Understanding how he actually practiced philosophy reveals dimensions that abstract summary misses. His primary practice was writing the essays themselves. This was not writing to transmit preformed thoughts, but writing as thinking, using the act of composition to discover what he believed, clarify confusion, test ideas against his experience. He would start essays not knowing where they would go, following associations, circling back, contradicting himself, revising over years without erasing the earlier contradictions. This method has profound implications for self-knowledge. You do not know what you think until you try to articulate it, and the articulation process changes what you think. Montaigne discovered his beliefs by attempting to write them, which is why his essays read more like explorations than arguments, journeys rather than destinations. He also practiced constant reading as conversation with the dead. His library contained about 1,000 books, a massive collection for the time, covering classical philosophy, history, poetry, contemporary science, and travel accounts. He read with pen in hand, writing marginal notes, arguing back, finding passages that spoke to current concerns. Reading for Montaigne was not passive absorption, but active engagement, treating authors as interlocutors in ongoing dialogue. But his most important practice was systematic self-observation. He watched his own mind with the detachment a scientist observes natural phenomena, noting patterns, contradictions, changes over time. This required a particular stance toward himself, neither inflating his importance nor dismissing his experience, but treating himself as data for understanding human nature. The practical application requires discipline most people never develop. It means noticing your actual behavior rather than your idealized self-image, observing the gap between what you claim to value and what you actually do, catching yourself in the act of self-deception. This is uncomfortable, which is why most people avoid it, preferring flattering stories about themselves to honest observation. Montaigne also practiced what we might call philosophical friendship, deep conversation aimed at mutual understanding rather than winning arguments. He sought people who would challenge him honestly, who cared more about discovering truth than defeating opponents. After La Boétie died, he never found this same intensity of intellectual companionship, but he continued the practice through correspondence and occasional meetings with other thoughtful people. Another practice was deliberate exposure to difference. He read accounts of distant cultures, examined customs opposed to his own, tried to understand worldviews he did not share. This was not tourism or exoticism, but methodical decentering, reminding himself that his own perspective was parochial, one view among many possible views. He also practiced physical simplicity. Despite wealth, he lived relatively simply, avoided luxury, ate modest meals, dressed without ostentation. This was not asceticism or religious mortification, but practical philosophy, reducing dependence on things that could be lost, maintaining freedom from attachments that would make him vulnerable to fortune's changes. Montaigne was deliberate about managing time and attention. He withdrew from legal career and public life to his estate, giving himself time for reading, writing, and thinking. He protected solitude fiercely, knowing that constant social demands would prevent the reflection necessary for self-knowledge. This was possible because of wealth, but within that privilege he used his freedom wisely for intellectual development. He also practiced acceptance of aging and decline. As he got older, he wrote about losing memory, physical vigour, sharpness of mind, but without the desperation modern culture encourages. He observed these changes with interest, as data about how human nature works over time, neither denying them nor treating them as catastrophes. This required philosophical preparation, using writing and reflection to cultivate acceptance before loss occurred. The most distinctive practice was his relationship to certainty and belief. Montaigne cultivated the ability to hold beliefs lightly, committing to positions for practical purposes while maintaining inner awareness that he might be wrong. This is extraordinarily difficult. It means acting decisively without the psychological comfort of certainty, making judgments while acknowledging their fallibility. Scholars analyze the essays, trying to reconstruct Montaigne's daily life and practices. We know he had a tower library where he worked. We know he walked daily. We know he enjoyed wine and conversation. But much remains mysterious about how exactly he structured his days, how much time he spent writing versus reading versus just thinking, how he balanced solitude with social demands. What we can extract from textual evidence is a set of practices that constituted his philosophical life. Daily writing as thinking, extensive reading as conversation, systematic self-observation, deliberate cultivation of uncertainty, exposure to difference, physical simplicity, protection of solitude, and acceptance of change. Together, these practices formed a way of life, not just a set of beliefs. The critique is that Montaigne's examined life required privileges unavailable to most people. Time for reflection, a private library, financial security, freedom from manual labour, all enabled by inherited wealth and social position. His philosophy of how to live might work wonderfully for aristocrats, but offers little to people struggling with poverty, oppression, or simply the demands of earning a living. Montaigne would likely acknowledge this partially. He never claimed his specific practices were universal possibilities. He described what worked for him given his circumstances. But he might argue that the underlying principles, honesty with oneself, attention to experience, cultivation of judgment, these can be practiced in any life, even if the specific forms differ. Modern readers sometimes try to extract practical techniques from Montaigne, treating him like a self-help author. Keep a journal, practice mindfulness, embrace uncertainty. These recommendations capture something of his approach. But they risk trivializing it, reducing a complex philosophical practice to life hacks. Montaigne's examined life was not a technique you apply, but an orientation toward existence that permeates everything. Where does his practical philosophy succeed most powerfully? In demonstrating that philosophy is not just academic theory, but lived practice that changes who you are. Reading philosophy can be entertainment or intellectual exercise, but actually practicing philosophical examination of your life is transformative, difficult, and rare. Montaigne showed what this looks like in practice, not perfectly but honestly, including failures and uncertainties. The contemporary relevance involves reclaiming philosophy as way of life rather than academic specialization. Ancient philosophy schools, Stoics, Epicureans, skeptics, all emphasized daily practices and way of life over theoretical systems. Modern academic philosophy lost this dimension, becoming technical analysis of concepts rather than guidance for living. Montaigne represents a tradition where philosophy is still about how to live, and his practical example matters more than his theoretical positions. Part 13. Evolution of a Mind. One of the most fascinating aspects of Montaigne's essays is that they span roughly 20 years, from early 1570s until his death in 1592, and you can watch his thinking evolve in real time. He revised earlier essays multiple times, often adding contradictory material without removing what he originally wrote, creating a layered text showing the evolution of a mind. In the earliest essays, Montaigne is recognizably Stoic. He emphasizes reason's sovereignty, discusses death constantly, quotes classical authorities approvingly, tries to master emotion through philosophical discipline. These essays read more conventionally philosophical, arguing positions, citing examples, building cases. The voice is still somewhat formal, the perspective that of an educated gentleman displaying his learning. But something changes after his near-death experience in 1569 and the death of his father. The essays become more personal, less interested in demonstrating erudition, more willing to contradict themselves and acknowledge uncertainty. His stoicism softens. He begins questioning whether philosophy can really master emotion, whether reason is as powerful as Stoics claim. By the middle period, roughly the 1580s, Montaigne has developed his distinctive style. Long, digressive essays that start with one topic and wander through many, constant self-reference, willingness to appear foolish or contradictory, skepticism about all claims to certain knowledge. The voice becomes more conversational, as if talking to a friend rather than instructing students. He is less interested in what he should think according to philosophy and more interested in what he actually thinks through honest observation. The late essays, written in his last years, show further evolution toward acceptance and even celebration of human weakness. Where early Montaigne fought against bodily limitation through Stoic discipline, late Montaigne accepts and even enjoys his physicality. Where early Montaigne sought wisdom through mastering passion, late Montaigne finds wisdom in acknowledging passion's ineliminability. The late essays are warmer, more generous, less judgmental. Scholars debate how to interpret this evolution. Some see steady progress from conventional learning toward genuine wisdom. Montaigne shedding received ideas to find his own voice. Others emphasize rupture, arguing that the near-death experience fundamentally changed him, creating a before and after in his thought. Still others claim the evolution is less dramatic than it appears, that seeds of his mature thought exist in early essays if you look carefully. The textual evidence supports all readings because Montaigne deliberately preserved earlier views he no longer held. Later editions of the essays contain layered revisions where he adds new material to old essays without removing the original text. So you have early Stoic passages followed by later skeptical additions that undermine them, creating productive tension within single essays. Why would he do this? Montaigne explains that he wants to show thought in motion, not present a finished system. He writes, "I do not paint being, I paint becoming," meaning he is portraying not static truths, but how thinking changes over time, how experience revises belief, how wisdom involves continuously rethinking rather than arriving at final positions. This has profound implications for how we read the essays. You cannot extract a single Montaigne position on most questions, because he held different positions at different times and preserved them all. The text becomes not a doctrine, but a record of intellectual development showing how one thoughtful person wrestled with fundamental questions across decades. The practical application is that your own views should evolve similarly. Beliefs you held at 20 should be questioned at 40, not because the earlier beliefs were stupid, but because experience provides new perspectives, life circumstances change, and rigid consistency is intellectual death. Montaigne models how to revise your thinking without embarrassment, owning your earlier views while acknowledging you have moved beyond them. One specific evolution concerns death. Early Montaigne obsessively discusses death, practicing philosophical preparation for mortality in Stoic fashion. Middle Montaigne, after his near-death experience, abandons this practice as counterproductive, arguing that nature handles death better than philosophical preparation. Late Montaigne circles back with more nuanced view, acknowledging death's reality without dwelling on it, accepting mortality without either obsessive preparation or denial. Another evolution concerns knowledge. Early Montaigne distrusts human reason, but still thinks philosophical inquiry can reach some truths. Middle Montaigne becomes radically skeptical, doubting whether humans can know anything with certainty. Late Montaigne softens this to practical skepticism, acknowledging we must act on uncertain beliefs while recognizing their uncertainty, finding wisdom in this acceptance rather than paralysis or dogmatism. His view of himself also evolves dramatically. Early essays present Montaigne as a specific individual, but one whose experiences illuminate general truths. Later, essays become more particular, emphasizing his uniqueness and oddities, claiming to describe only himself. Yet, paradoxically, the more particular he becomes, the more universal his insights feel, because honest specificity reveals human nature better than false generalization. Montaigne's attitude toward his own writing changes too. Early on, he seems to write for readers, to communicate ideas and persuade. Increasingly, he writes for himself, using writing as tool for self-understanding, regardless of whether others benefit. Late essays sometimes read as if he forgot anyone else would read them. They are so personal and self-focused, yet this makes them more rather than less valuable to readers, because the honesty is more complete. Critics point out that not all changes represent progress. Some late essays seem more confused than early ones, less structured, harder to follow. His skepticism sometimes becomes so extreme it is incoherent, doubting his own doubt until nothing remains. The evolution might be as much decline due to aging as philosophical development, loss of focus rather than deeper insight. Defenders respond that intellectual development is not linear progress toward greater clarity. Sometimes deepening understanding means recognizing that questions are more complex than you initially thought, that neat answers were superficial, that confusion is more honest than false clarity. Late Montaigne's apparent confusion might be sophisticated recognition of complexity that early Montaigne's neatness missed. Where does tracking Montaigne's evolution matter most? In showing that serious thinking is a lifelong process, not achievement of final positions. The essays demonstrate that intellectual honesty requires revising your views as experience accumulates and perspective shifts, neither clinging defensively to earlier beliefs nor abandoning them carelessly for novelty. This is hard to do. It requires ego strength to admit error and intellectual courage to keep questioning even comfortable established views. The contemporary relevance is powerful in age of rigid positions. Modern discourse demands you state your position and defend it against all comers, treating revision as weakness and consistency as virtue. Montaigne shows the opposite, that consistency can be vice when it means refusing to learn, and revision is intellectual virtue when driven by honest engagement with experience. In cancel culture that attacks people for past statements inconsistent with current views, Montaigne's model of public intellectual evolution offers alternative where growth is celebrated rather than punished. Part 14. Montaigne's Legacy. Montaigne's influence on Western thought is vast, yet often unrecognized, because it worked through transformation of sensibility rather than explicit doctrine. He taught people to think differently, not by providing answers, but by modeling a new way of asking questions. His most immediate influence was on the essay form itself. Before Montaigne, the word essay did not exist as literary genre. He invented it, or rather, he invented the idea that personal, digressive, unsystematic reflection could be valuable philosophical writing. Francis Bacon in England, writing shortly after, adopted the essay form but made it more systematic and aphoristic, losing Montaigne's wandering quality. Later, essayists like Addison, Steele, Lamb, Hazlitt, and eventually modern personal essayists all trace lineage to Montaigne's innovation. Beyond form, he influenced the birth of modern subjectivity. Medieval thinkers wrote about their religious experiences but rarely examined their ordinary minds as philosophical subject matter. Montaigne made the individual's inner life central to philosophy, anticipating the subjective turn that would dominate modern thought from Descartes through phenomenology and existentialism. Descartes read Montaigne and reacted against him powerfully. Descartes' entire philosophical project, seeking absolute certainty through methodical doubt, was designed to overcome Montaigne's skepticism. Where Montaigne embraced uncertainty and found wisdom in accepting human limitation, Descartes sought to rebuild knowledge on unshakable foundations. Yet even in opposition, Descartes demonstrates Montaigne's influence. His method of radical doubt comes directly from Montaigne, even though his response differs dramatically. Pascal engaged Montaigne more sympathetically. He found Montaigne's skepticism about reason compelling, but thought it led to despair without Christian faith. Pascal's famous wager, arguing you should believe in God because the payoff is infinite if true and loss minimal if false, responds to Montaigne's uncertainty by embracing it strategically. Pascal learned from Montaigne how to write personally and psychologically while adding religious certainty Montaigne lacked. The Enlightenment had complex relationship with Montaigne. Voltaire and Diderot admired his tolerance and skepticism about authority, seeing him as proto-Enlightenment thinker, undermining religious dogma. But Enlightenment confidence in reason and progress ultimately rejected Montaigne's deeper skepticism about human capacity to know truth or improve fundamentally. They wanted his tolerance without his uncertainty, which Montaigne would have seen as inconsistent. Rousseau explicitly rejected Montaigne's influence. Rousseau found his self-examination superficial, claiming Montaigne only portrayed his surface, while Rousseau would reveal his true depths in the Confessions. Yet Rousseau's autobiographical project, making oneself the subject of extended examination, would have been unthinkable without Montaigne's precedent. The difference is that Rousseau sought to justify himself, while Montaigne sought to understand himself, which produces radically different kinds of self-revelation. Romanticism embraced different aspects of Montaigne. The Romantics loved his celebration of individual experience, his attention to feeling and embodiment, his resistance to systematic philosophy. But they added emotional intensity and metaphysical ambition Montaigne lacked, seeking transcendent meaning through subjective experience where Montaigne found only human particularity. In the 19th century, Emerson brought Montaigne to American thought. Emerson wrote a famous essay on Montaigne, calling him the skeptic, admiring his balanced judgment and refusal of extremes. Emersonian self-reliance owes much to Montaigne's individualism, though Emerson's optimism about human potential contrasts with Montaigne's more modest view. Nietzsche profoundly admired Montaigne, calling him one of the few writers who increased his joy in existence. Nietzsche loved Montaigne's honesty about human nature, his refusal to moralize or pretend humans are better than they are, his cheerful acceptance of limitation. Nietzsche's perspectivism, the idea that all knowledge is from specific perspectives without absolute viewpoint, directly continues Montaigne's insights. His style, aphoristic and contradictory, also owes debt to Montaigne's example. 20th century existentialism engaged Montaigne extensively. Camus saw him as exemplar of absurd hero, continuing to think and write honestly despite recognizing life's ultimate meaninglessness. Sartre's phenomenological descriptions of consciousness, though more systematic, pursue Montaigne's project of describing subjective experience accurately. The existentialist emphasis on authenticity and self-creation through choice resonates with Montaigne's focus on becoming yourself through examined living. Contemporary philosophy rediscovered Montaigne in recent decades. Scholars like Sarah Bakewell's popular biography and Anne Hartle's philosophical studies introduced him to new audiences. Feminist philosophers found his attention to embodiment and emotion valuable for critiquing rationalist tradition. Virtue ethicists cite his focus on character over rules. Critics of foundationalism use his skepticism to undermine claims of absolute knowledge. But beyond academic philosophy, Montaigne's influence on general educated culture is immense. The very idea of the personal essay, memoir as philosophical exploration, honest self-examination as valuable activity, all trace to his example. Therapy culture's emphasis on self-knowledge, though often simplified, continues his project. The assumption that individual experience matters philosophically, not just as example of universal truths, but as itself worth examining, this is Montaigne's legacy, so complete we no longer recognize it as his innovation. Critics argue that Montaigne's legacy has negative aspects. His radical individualism arguably contributed to modern atomization and loss of community. His skepticism about political reform has been used to justify complacency about injustice, telling oppressed people to accept their circumstances. His aristocratic perspective, dressed as universal wisdom, might reinforce class privilege by making upper-class sensibilities seem naturally superior. Others defend that Montaigne has been misread and oversimplified. Modern individualism owes more to Descartes and liberal political theory than to Montaigne, whose focus on self-knowledge was always relational and situated. His political conservatism was a context-specific response to religious civil war, not universal doctrine. And his perspective, while privileged, involved such thorough self-questioning that it undermined rather than reinforced the very privilege enabling it. Where is Montaigne's legacy most powerful today? In creating space for uncertainty and complexity in intellectual life. Academic culture rewards strong claims and systematic theories. Public discourse demands clear positions and confident assertions. Montaigne's example of productive uncertainty, honest confusion, willingness to contradict oneself, this remains vital counterweight to false clarity and premature closure. His legacy also matters in resisting the quantification of everything. Modern culture wants to measure, optimize, and systematize all aspects of human life. Montaigne's essays demonstrate that the most important things, wisdom, character, friendship, meaning, resist measurement and systematization. They are qualities of lived experience that you can only describe phenomenologically, not calculate or optimize. The contemporary challenge is how to preserve Montaigne's insights without simply repeating him. His context, 16th century France, differs radically from ours. His specific views on many matters are dated or wrong. But his method, his orientation toward existence, his intellectual honesty, these remain valuable if we can adapt them to contemporary circumstances without losing what made them powerful. Part 15. Where Montaigne fails. To properly assess Montaigne requires acknowledging where his philosophy fails, where his insights become blind spots, where his wisdom turns into error. This is not to diminish his achievement, but to avoid the hagiography that distorts rather than honours his legacy. His most glaring failure is the privilege problem. Montaigne's entire philosophical project assumed leisure, wealth, education and freedom from manual labour that only tiny elite possessed. He never adequately acknowledged that his examined life was possible only because others, servants, peasants, his wife managing the estate, did the work that freed him for reflection. His philosophy risks becoming wisdom for aristocrats that implicitly justifies inequality by focusing entirely on how privileged people should use their privilege. This is not just about acknowledging privilege. It is about whether his insights apply beyond his narrow social position. Can someone working long hours in dangerous conditions practice his methods of self-examination? Can someone without education engage in his style of reading and writing? Can someone facing survival pressures cultivate his detachment from outcomes? Montaigne offers little guidance here, implicitly assuming his readers share his material security. His treatment of gender is another major failure. Women appear in the essays mostly as sexual objects or examples of superstition and weakness. He occasionally praises specific women, but never questions the systematic exclusion of women from education, political power, and intellectual life. His philosophy of the self is implicitly masculine, assuming male bodies and male social positions as default human experience. When he does discuss women, he often combines admiration with condescension. He praises women's practical wisdom while denying them capacity for abstract thought, celebrates female virtue while assuming it requires male guidance, discusses female sexuality with mixture of fascination and disgust. Even his relatively enlightened views for his time, like arguing women have sexual desires too, come wrapped in patriarchal assumptions he never examined. His relationship to slavery and colonialism also reveals failure of imagination. Montaigne wrote about indigenous peoples in Americas with more sympathy than most Europeans. His essay on cannibals challenges European superiority. But he owned property that likely involved enslaved labour, and he never seriously questioned whether the entire colonial enterprise was unjust, only whether Europeans were right to consider indigenous people barbaric. His cultural relativism stopped short of challenging European expansion itself. More fundamentally, Montaigne's skepticism becomes incoherent when pushed to its logical conclusion. If all beliefs are uncertain and custom-based, including this belief itself, then the skeptical position undermines itself. He acknowledges this occasionally, but never resolves it, just accepts the paradox. This is honest, but philosophically unsatisfying. You cannot build anything on thoroughgoing skepticism because the foundation dissolves under its own weight. His political conservatism, while understandable in context, fails to provide resources for opposing injustice. If all political systems are arbitrary and reform is dangerous, how do you justify abolishing slavery, extending rights, or challenging tyranny? Montaigne's framework counsels caution that can easily become complicity, maintaining existing power structures because change is risky. History shows that sometimes radical change is necessary despite risks, and Montaigne offers little guidance for when reform is required. His emphasis on individual self-examination risks narcissism and solipsism. Making yourself the primary subject of philosophy can become self-absorption, treating your particular experiences as uniquely interesting when they are often quite ordinary. Montaigne avoids this, partly through honesty and humour, but the danger remains, and many who follow his method fall into it. Modern memoir and personal essay often mistake self-revelation for insight, assuming that describing your feelings constitutes wisdom. Montaigne's method also lacks resources for collective problems requiring coordinated action. Climate change, nuclear weapons, pandemics, these demand systematic thinking and collective solutions that his individualist skeptical approach cannot provide. His wisdom helps individuals navigate their lives, but offers little for humanity navigating shared challenges requiring certainty and commitment despite incomplete knowledge. His treatment of reason is inconsistent and ultimately unclear. He attacks reason as unreliable, shows how bodily states influence thinking, emphasizes emotion's role in judgment. Yet he also uses reason constantly in his essays, makes arguments, draws inferences, tries to convince readers. If reason is as unreliable as he claims, why trust any of his reasoning? He never clarifies what role reason should play after its pretensions are deflated. The wandering essay method, while powerful for certain purposes, limits what philosophy can achieve. You cannot do mathematics, logic, or systematic science through Montaignean digression. Even in ethics and political philosophy, some problems require sustained argument, building on premises to reach conclusions, not just exploring different perspectives. Montaigne's method captures certain truths, but misses others that systematic thinking reveals. His focus on self-understanding risks making philosophy too subjective and inaccessible. If everyone's self is unique and knowable primarily from within, how do we build shared knowledge? How do we correct errors or compare insights? Montaigne's approach can seem to make each person's perspective equally valid, with no way to adjudicate between them, producing relativism he claims to avoid. He also fails to adequately address moral evil and tragedy. His sunny acceptance of human imperfection works for ordinary vices and limitations, but what about genocide, torture, slavery, systematic oppression? His framework seems better suited to explaining minor moral failures than confronting radical evil. He lived through terrible violence, but his philosophy seems to observe it from safe distance rather than engaging its depths. Montaigne's celebration of embodiment can become an excuse for not controlling appetites. Yes, we are physical beings with needs and desires that should not be denied, but some desires are destructive and should be resisted. His criticism of excessive self-control can flip into insufficient self-control, accepting whatever you feel like doing as natural, therefore acceptable. The balance he advocates is real, but hard to find, and his guidance is vague. His philosophy of friendship, while beautiful, is so demanding and rare that it offers little practical guidance for most relationships. He sets such high standards for perfect friendship that almost no one achieves it, then has little to say about ordinary friendships, professional relationships, or how to build community among people who are not soulmates. This creates a two-tier system where true relationship is nearly unattainable and everything else is somehow inadequate. The death philosophy in his later essays risks complacency about suffering. Trusting nature to handle death works fine if death comes quickly and relatively painlessly, but this is not everyone's experience. For those facing prolonged deterioration, his cheerful acceptance seems inadequate, almost dismissive of their suffering. His perspective reflects his own relatively comfortable experience, not the range of possible deaths. Finally, Montaigne fails to provide clear guidance for action in uncertain conditions. Yes, uncertainty is real and should be acknowledged, but we must still make decisions affecting ourselves and others. How do we choose wisely when multiple options seem reasonable? How do we commit to projects requiring sustained effort when doubt about ultimate meaning remains? Montaigne describes the problem brilliantly, but offers little practical help for navigating it. These failures do not invalidate Montaigne's insights. Every philosopher has limitations reflecting their historical moment, social position, and individual blind spots. What matters is whether the insights remain valuable despite failures, and whether we can learn from both the successes and the failures. Montaigne himself would likely approve of this balanced assessment. He never claimed perfection and explicitly invited readers to see his limitations. The contemporary task is integrating Montaigne's genuine wisdom while correcting his failures through perspectives he lacked. Feminist philosophy can preserve his embodied approach while including women's experiences he ignored. Critical theory can use his skepticism about authority while providing resources for challenging injustice his conservatism avoided. Collective action theory can learn from his insights about uncertainty while developing methods for coordinated response to shared problems. Montaigne's ultimate value might be less in specific doctrines than in modelling intellectual honesty that includes acknowledging your own limitations. He would want his philosophy questioned, challenged, improved through engagement with problems and perspectives beyond his ken. The best way to honour his legacy is not uncritical acceptance, but critical continuation, taking what remains valuable while building something better from honest confrontation with what he missed.